Good morning, everybody. If you want to follow along in your Bibles this morning, you can open up to Matthew chapter 6, which is where we will be in our time together this morning. It's an exciting time of year again. The next time, if the Lord wills, in another week, it will be September. And coming to the home stretch of the year, but the starting line of another school year, which is always exciting for many of us. We got to hang out with a few Laurel High School students yesterday as they painted some of their parking spots, which was a pretty cool thing for us. New thing that we're doing this year there, so that was a good time. But we've got a lot of different things going on, a lot of different if you attend a Laurel school, you're going back to school tomorrow. If you attend neighboring schools, many of them are going back after the Labor Day holiday. But going to get back out into the world a little bit, going to see some new people, and I think it's always good to remember the teachings of Jesus when we do that. We're picking up this morning pretty much in the middle of the Sermon on the Mount. Sermon on the Mount, of course, is most recognized in Matthew because it's the most detailed account of it. However, it's not the only gospel that shares with you some of the teachings of Jesus in this particular event. But it really is transformative preaching, is what it is. The Sermon on the Mount is probably the most concentrated area of Jesus teaching us how to live and how to be that there is anywhere in the Bible. If you have a red letter edition, there's a lot of pages of red. It's really the only place like that. There's not a lot of black print in that 3 or 4 pages right there. It's pretty much Jesus teaching, and a lot of his teachings have to do with contrasting what people have been taught versus the way God really wants people to be. Talks about a lot of different things, and I personally would love for us to have like an 8-hour service where we just work through the whole thing. If you have feedback on that, you can talk to the elders afterward when you'd like to schedule that. But because it's so hard to take out pieces from the middle of it, but it's also important because it's important teachings from Jesus that we have to look at. So we're going to pick up starting in chapter 6 today. In verse 1, that says, "Beware of practicing your righteousness before men to be noticed by them. Otherwise, you have no reward with your Father who is in heaven." Now, we've talked about this. I've stood up here and talked about this a little bit not that long ago. This idea of practicing your righteousness before men to be noticed by them. But let's understand quickly what that was talking about in the original context that Jesus said it. Okay, Jesus is living, and we talked about this a little bit at the end of Bible class actually this morning. We kind of came across this a little bit. The idea that Jesus is primarily speaking to the downtrodden, speaking to the common man. And you have, in this time, you have Jewish leaders that are basically responsible for making sure the common people stay in line. And then you have the Jews living within this time of empire. And as long as the Jewish leaders could keep the people in line, then the Roman leaders would be okay with them and just let them survive. Let them live their lives however they wanted to live their lives. Oftentimes, when you're seeing any teaching of Jesus really, Jesus' biggest opposition is not common people. Jesus' biggest opposition is religious and governmental leadership. Religious leadership in the near term, governmental leadership in the larger scale. Because the religious leadership was motivated by keeping the governmental leadership off their back. So that is the context in which Jesus does an overwhelming majority of his teaching. That's hard for us to then put ourselves in that context because that's not the way we live. We are not, in our society, an oppressed people that have religious leaders making sure that we stay in line so that the government stays happy. That's not necessarily the way our lives work. So oftentimes when we look at this, we might forget or misunderstand exactly the context that Jesus is living in and talking about, because frankly, it's not our context. We are not the downtrodden. We are not the dregs of society, as it were. That's not who we are. So yet, when you remember this, it's a very interesting concept, what he talks about here. Because he says, again in verse 1, beware of practicing your righteousness before men to be noticed by them. Otherwise, you will have no reward with your Father who is in heaven. Now, at this time, everyone is hearing him. He's got common people listening to him. He's got leaders listening to him. And why would he say such a thing? Because the common people, again, are looking to the leadership. Now, this we should be able to relate to just a bit. Okay? Because how do we learn about religious things? Hopefully, everyone has a structure within your home where you're working through these things together. The practicality is that may be happening a little bit, it may not be happening at all, it may be happening inconsistently, or you may have a thriving spiritual situation in your home. But I'd be willing to guess that everyone doesn't have that. So when you don't have that, you come to places like this to learn. How much have you learned in your life about prayer by watching or listening to someone stand up here and say a prayer? How much have you learned about anything? How much have you learned about who Jesus is, or what the Old Testament is, or what the Bible is? How much have you learned about that from coming to a place like this and listening to someone stand where I'm standing tell you what that is and how that works? And you say, that's a nice person, I like them, sounds good to me, let's go with it. And that's what we do. And you have a perpetual continuing of teachings that we hope are all accurate. They are not all accurate. Breaking news. I know that because I've stood here and said things I think are wrong now, as I've grown. Okay? So I can guarantee you not everything said from this place is 100% accurate. Okay? It's also true about them. Not everything that they hear is 100% accurate either. Now that changes when Jesus shows up. What Jesus says is 100% accurate. Okay? So he says, beware of practicing your righteousness before men to be noticed by them. Why? Because that is sometimes what happens. And again, this is one of those stories where we listen to this idea and we think, okay, when I leave here, I have to make sure that I don't do this. Well, I would like us to expand that and say, when I come here, I can't do that either. Because the reality is, what looks like righteousness in this context gets you approval by men. And that's a deep temptation, especially when you're a person up here. There are things that I can say that I believe the Bible teaches to the core of my being, that I know every single person, I think every single person, the overwhelming majority, will say amen and back it up. And there are other things, not so much. And that puts pressure on you when you're up here. Do I say the things that I think Jesus says, even though I know you're going to disagree with it, or do I just stick to the things that I know that you're going to agree with? It's a difficult thing about being in this situation. And Jesus says, in this context, I know there are people that are going to give in to that. There are people that are going to stand in front of you and say things just to make you happy, or, in this context, to make governmental leadership happy. They're going to do it for show. That's what you've seen. That's what you've learned by watching them. And I am telling you, that's not the thing to do. You have to exercise genuine righteousness. Otherwise, you have no reward with your Father who is in heaven. In other words, you don't find favor with him with what you're doing. So then he starts listing examples. And we're not going to get into all these examples that he talks about here in Matthew chapter 6, but we're going to look at the first, at least one, maybe two, depending on how long it takes to get through the first one. Verse 2 says, so when you give to the poor, do not sound a trumpet before you, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets, so that they may be honored by men. Truly I say to you, they have their reward in full. But when you give to the poor, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving will be in secret, and so your Father, who sees what is done in secret, will reward you. Now, the next three things he talks about, we're not going to talk about them all today, but the next three things he talks about is he says, when you give to the poor, when you pray, when you fast. We're not even going to get into fasting at all today. We are certainly not on a meal day. We're not going to get a whole lot into prayer, although we'll talk about some of it a little bit, I think, time permitting, but we're definitely going to talk about giving to the poor. Three things. When you give to the poor, when you pray, when you fast. Okay? Now, I want you to ask yourself, this past week, did you give to the poor? Did you pray? Did you fast? Are you 0 for 1? Or excuse me, are you 0 for 3? Are you 1 for 3? Are you 2 for 3? Are you 3 for 3? Every one of you, one of those four things. Every one of us is one of those four things. You see, Jesus is assuming that when he talks to these people, these are things that they are doing. These are expectations of these folks. They do these things. So this is not a teaching of, this is what you need to do. The teaching is, I know that you know that you're going to do that you should do these things. You're doing these things. So when you do them, and then he teaches the practices. 2,000 years later, we've got lots of people who don't even participate in these practices. Not an issue Jesus necessarily had to deal with. Okay? So he's assuming you're going to do these things. Now again, these are not super rich people. These are certainly not people in the same economic brackets that many of us find ourselves in today, but yet there's an assumption that they're going to help each other. He assumes that we're going to give to the poor. There's an assumption of loving the poor. He's taught that. Loving people, loving the poor. What's our attitude towards the poor? Sometimes in our culture, we're kind of annoyed by them, right? We try to make sense out of why they're poor. They're lazy. They make bad decisions. Because we have this fundamental belief that we've been fed that anybody can be as prosperous as they want to be if they just try hard enough. You know what I'm talking about. But yet we have to know that's not true. We have to know that's just not the case. But yet that's what we pretend. We don't even pretend it, we proclaim it like it's a real thing. Jesus tells us there's always going to be the poor among us. So if we all have the choice in our own hands, I don't know why Jesus can so confidently say there will always be poor among you. If it's just as simple as, I just need to try harder. It doesn't always work that way. We're always going to have the poor around us. So when we give to them, because we are going to give to them, that's what Jesus says. That's the assumption here. And what he says is, don't draw a lot of attention to yourself when you do that. Don't draw a lot of attention to yourself when you're doing that. Because it's not about everyone looking at you and telling you how great and generous you are. It's about actually helping people. It's about being ready to serve, not being ready to be praised. Because that's not the same thing by any stretch. You can do good things with a bad motive. That's very possible. Okay? And Jesus is saying, if you're going to do that, that's fine, but just understand, I mean, it's not fine, but if you can do that, that's your choice, but you're not going to really win favor for God. So if you're saying, I'm a follower of God, and because I love God, I'm going to give to the poor, when you wave your hands and say, look at all that I'm doing, look at all that I'm doing, just know that's not about God anymore, that's about you. In fact, verse 3 tells us that we're supposed to be so secret. And again, this is imagery that Jesus gives here. He says, but when you give to the poor, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. Okay? Now, obviously, this is not something where you have to put one hand in the pocket so the one hand doesn't see it. We know this is a metaphor, right? But the idea is to be so low-key about it that no one really notices. Now, is he saying that no one can know or it doesn't count? That's not what he's saying. Okay? He's just trying to create an image here that you understand that it's not about being showy. And being showy is very, very, very tempting because it's fun to have people pat you on the back. And the reality is, if you're not seeking that, I would venture to say you don't probably have a lot of people patting you on the back about things. There's a lot of people that do a lot of stuff that it's just assumed that that's what they do. You find that in any walk of life. At our school, there's always people there. All the schools that I've ever worked in. I've worked in 5 or 6 schools now. Every single one of them, there's people there way before they have to be there. There's people there way after they're allowed to leave. And I can tell you as a principal, I don't walk room to room patting them all on the back every single day. I don't do that. They don't get thanked all the time for doing all the things. There are things that they do that I don't even know about. And that's okay. When you do that kind of stuff for praise, what happens is when you don't get the praise, you stop doing it. When you do that stuff for God, it doesn't matter. You just keep doing it. That's the difference. There are people in our congregation always ready, willing to serve. And if no one asks them to do something, they find something to do. Because when we give to the poor, when we serve in this way, it's not about someone saying, you're so generous. Now, it's okay if you see someone, you say, thank you so much for being so generous. That's fine. If it's not you doing it, if it's someone else doing it, make sure that you thank them if you see it. But that thank you should have no bearing on whether they do it again or not. Because it's not about your thanks, it's about God. He says, don't let anyone know what your right hand is doing when you give to the poor, so that your giving will be in secret, and your Father sees what is done. Who sees what is done in secret will reward you. See, here's the good thing about good things. God always sees it. God always sees it. So it doesn't matter if anybody else sees it. When you pray, here's another assumption. When you pray, assumption is you're going to pray. Now, again, in this context, lots of things done in the public square, right? A lot of religious things going on in front of lots of people. So the idea of praying in front of people, while for many of us that's a foreign idea, for them, this is a pretty common idea. When you go to Walmart, imagine 4 or 5 people out in the different places in the parking lot. Oh, thank you, Lord, for this, and thank you, Lord, for that, and oh, praise God be with it. That's kind of what's going on, minus the Walmart and the paving. But that's what's going on in this culture. A lot of things are happening publicly and for people to see. But when you pray, because you're going to pray, you are not to be like the hypocrites. For they love to stand and pray in the synagogues on the street corners so that they may be seen by men. Truly I say to you, they have their reward in full. Now when you talk about hypocrites, so what is Jesus talking about when someone is a hypocrite? He's not talking about a person who necessarily, because we use that word, and it's a person who tells you, eat green vegetables. And then they go home and they don't eat any green vegetables all week. That's what we see as a hypocrite, right? Someone who says one thing and does another. And that is a kind of hypocrite, right? In this context, though, he's talking about people that are doing things for you to see, but really don't have the heart in it. So he's not talking about a mismatch between our words and our behavior, like we usually say it. He's more talking about a mismatch between the heart and the behavior, which is kind of the same thing. A little bit different, but kind of the same thing. The idea that the heart for what I'm doing, the motive for what I'm doing, it looks as if it is this, but it is actually something else. Okay? So he says, for they stand and pray in the synagogues on the street corners so that they may be seen by men. Truly I say to you, they have the reward in full. This is something we can do now. Again, standing up front. You know, it's easy to stand up here and do this so that I feel better about myself. It's easy to stand up here and do this and then just sit and wait for all the. That's one of the funny things about, you know, standing at the door. I don't do that, but people can. I have no problem with people that do that. You know, just make sure if you're preaching a sermon, you go stand by the door. I don't know if Daniel or Troy does that. If you do, I'm not calling you out. I'm just using this as an example. If you stand by the door, you know, just make sure you're not standing there so everybody can tell you how good of a job you did. Okay? All right? No problem standing at the door, but stand at the door to genuinely greet people as they leave, because you want to see them. Okay? Because if you do that, then you've done your work. Then you've received your reward. You've got the pat on the back that you were after. Verse 6 says, "But you, when you pray, go into your inner room, close your door, and pray to your Father who is in secret, and your Father sees what is done in secret will reward you." Again, what's he talking about here? Is he talking about that it is a sin to ever pray in front of another human? Of course not. Of course that's not what he's saying. He's talking about the attitude towards prayer. And the attitude towards prayer is that which I'm going to not do it for all of you. I'm going to do it for God and my own faith in him. Now, do I think we should have an individual prayer life? Yes, I do. I do think we should. I think Jesus speaks to that here. Because again, you're going to make your own decisions. You're going to make your own determinations about things in your life. You're going to make your own choices about, you know, whether you believe this is the way Jesus wants you to go in this situation, or whether you're going to turn away from that and do something else. You're going to have to make individual decisions. So you probably ought to have an individual relationship with God. You probably ought to have a collective relationship with God, with us as well. The Bible teaches that also. So it's not just one or the other, it's all of it. But when you do that, the point is it is not for show. It's not for people to pat you on the back. You say the best prayers. Now, if you think someone stands up here and says the best prayers, I probably wouldn't use the word best because it's not a competition. But you could certainly say, I appreciate what you said in your prayer today. That's fine. That's encouragement. That's wonderful. But what we can't do is have people coming up front and doing it so that they get that. I'm going to say this thing in my prayer today because I know this thing really matters to Sean. And if I say this, Sean will come up to me afterward and tell me I did a good job on the prayer today. So that's why I'm going to say it. That's not what we're after. And that's not what God is after. Verse 7, "And when you are praying, do not use meaningless repetition as Gentiles do, for they suppose that they will be heard for their many words." I think one of the most dangerous things we can do, and I just touched on it just a second ago, but one of the most dangerous things we can do, and I'm going to try to say this and not go on a separate tangent, I'm going to try real hard, is to compare ourselves to each other. Because that's what this is about. This is about, I know more than you. Therefore, I am going to say words that you don't know. I'm going to say things over and over again. I'm going to weave a tapestry of the language that you're going to be so wowed by and think, wow, he's really smart. And completely lose track of the idea that I'm trying to praise and worship God. How does that happen? That happens when we compare each other to each other. He's a better prayer than he is. She does a better job than he does. He does a better job than she does. At whatever aspect of the Lord's work we're talking about. When we start comparing each other, we start missing the boat. I mean, there's a temptation to do that now, right? I mean, you hear from 3 different people a month. I like it better when he preaches versus when he preaches. You know what? He does a lot better job than he does. You know, why don't they just skip Dave? I don't understand. Why don't they just skip his week? Probably because I make the schedule. But, you know, it's not about comparing. The Lord's work is not about comparison. It's not about listen to the words that I say in my prayer in this context and think that I'm holier than everybody else. I'm thinking that I'm holier than the other people, because a lot of it in this context and in context around the world is a lot like that, right? I mean, let's be honest. We've got somebody coming in next month, right? Right? Somebody's going to come in and with an interest to want to live next door. Is the idea. And some of you are not going to be able to help yourselves except think about, well, I've got to see somebody else because I've got to compare them to somebody. Right? Got to have comparisons. It's got to be a competition. It's not. It doesn't have to be a competition. In fact, it's not supposed to be a competition. In this context, you've got all these people in the community saying this, saying that, saying that. And they're tempted to have the motivation, I want these people, as they come into the temple courts, as they come into the community, I want them to come to my corner and listen to me. Therefore, I'm going to say all these words so they'll come listen to me. Not because I can introduce them to God, but because I want it to be about me. I would think in this world it's very hard, and I'm not criticizing these, I am criticizing these guys, I guess, but I would think it'd be very hard to be like a TV evangelist, right? Because the entire point of TV is to sell advertising. In order to sell advertising, you got to get people to watch you. So you got to do something that distinguishes yourself to everyone else, that they'll watch you, and some company will advertise during your show. That's television. That's what it is. I don't know how in the world you can go function in a culture that's based on competition and drop the competitive piece. It's hard. I would think that'd be very, very hard. And I would think, like a lot of things, people may very well get into it with the right motives, and then the process itself chews you up and spits you out. But we can't let that happen. We cannot be driven by a desire to sound more holy than someone else. To sound more like we're from God than someone else. What we have to do is just say God's words. Because that's the deal. The teachings of Jesus is the deal. That's what it's about. But listen to what it says. Listen to what Jesus says in verse 7. He says, and when you're praying, do not use meaningless repetitions as the Gentiles do, for they suppose they will be heard for their many words. Now, specifically here, he talks about the Gentiles. He talks about a people that have kind of been separated, right? So they might feel like they've got to do something extra to be heard by God, right? And see, the great thing about Jesus is Jesus says, no, I'm here to open God's doors to everyone. But some people may have some kind of insecurity. So they feel like they have to do extra things in order to get the attention of God. This is a different issue than what we talked about before. What we talked about all up to this point is about pride. It's about, I think I'm so good, God can't help but listen to me. Now we're talking about insecurity. Okay? And let me tell you something I believe. I believe every person in this room and every person in this world fights with at least one of these two things. I'm so good, God can't help but listen to me, or I'm so bad, God would never listen to me. I think those two things run rampant in people. Depending on your stage in life, you may have experienced both at different times. And the reality to those things is false. You are not so good that God can't help but listen to you. And you are not so bad that God will not listen to you. Both of those things are true. And each of those things applies to every single one of us. Because people, if we know one thing about people, we, not they, we struggle with moderation. The Gentiles thought they had to do more, and Jesus saying, no, that's not how it works. pray with a pure heart, pray with a spirit of reaching out to God, trying to please God. He goes in and then follows this, and we're not going to get into this today, but then he goes into teaching them how to pray, right? Because Jesus is the greatest teacher that's ever lived by far. So he says, if I'm going to tell you that you're going to do something, let me tell you how to do it. Let me show you how this works. That's what great teachers do, right? He goes into that. But what he is saying here is he's saying the motive has got to be right. The motive has got to be pleasing God. You've got to give to the poor. No question about it. It's not even a discussion. But when you do it, you've got to do it not so people will see and think you're so great, but because you love God, you love people, and you serve God through serving people. And do that as privately as you can. Same thing with prayer. You got to pray. Not even a discussion. But when you do it, you got to make sure it's between you and God. It's about you opening your heart to God. It's about building relationship with God. It's not about you doing that to show everybody else how smart you are. And you don't have to do anything extra. Even though God is so great, you may think you got to do something extra to get him to listen to you. You don't. You just got to open your heart. You got to be genuine. You got to be real. When he talks about fasting, he talks about the exact same thing. Again, we don't have time for that today. He talks about the exact thing. The idea that Jesus is getting to here is you've seen a lot of stuff around you. You've seen a lot of people that call themselves religious leaders. You see a lot of people that have a lot of authority in here. And you've been taught your whole life to think those people are doing it right. Well, let me tell you, this is the way to do it right. You do it humbly, and you do it for God. And in this context, we're talking about giving to the poor, and we're talking about praying. But the reality is that concept and that idea applies to every single thing that we do in our lives. If you do it humbly and you do it for God, that's the key. If this morning we can help you in any way, if there's anything that you'd like to express to the congregation, you'd like prayers for, you can do that at this time by coming forward as we stand and sing.